Hello and welcome to the Kentucky Today podcast. I'm Lawrence Smith, the editor of Kentucky Today. Kentucky Senate Bill 181 was designed to help protect public school students from being groomed for potential abuse. It limits how public school teachers, staff, and volunteers can communicate with students. They must use traceable platforms approved by the school district. But now that the bill is law, it's led to many questions, including how student pastors, who often volunteer in schools, may or may not communicate with students from their own churches. To help answer those questions, I sat down with the bill's sponsor, Senator Lindsey Tichenor of LaGrange. First of all, explain this new law. It essentially limits communication between school teachers, staff, volunteers, and students, right? Talk about what it does and why.
So this bill, for me, came about in 2024. I actually filed this piece of legislation in the previous session and didn't get any movement on it, but it came out of a lot of stories coming my way. One in particular was out of Anderson County, where a counselor inserted herself into a student's life to such an extent that she consistently contacted that student over 200 times privately and convinced her to turn her parents into CPS because that counselor didn't think those parents were parenting the right way. And truly such an overstep of the role of a counselor in a student's life to contact them that many times privately and build that relationship really in a grooming fashion. So that was what brought this bill about in 2024. In 2025, I was approached by the Educational Professional Standards Board and KDE to address the issue of grooming, and met with them several times, looked at a lot of data that they have regarding educator sexual misconduct and other cases that are just within the school system that involve counseling, involve volunteers or coaches that keep popping up in the news. And I decided this was the best move to make in order to address grooming, and that was to go towards where the access point is. And there was a study in Kentucky that was done with EPSB data last year, I believe, and they were able to determine over a 5-year period of time, 70% of these cases, the access point is through technology and communications. So really, this bill is returning to what used to be the way we communicated, bringing the parents into the conversation. We've seen technology obviously advance so rapidly that almost every student has a phone in their hand. And we're addressing that issue as well with students having phones during class time in schools. But we've really not been intentional about putting parameters in place to protect students from bad actors who, right now we just don't have the boundaries. We don't have the guardrails in place. And this private communication with students, which never happened when I was growing up, when you were growing up, has become a normal thing. And really, this is just to reestablish those previous guardrails.
So this requires communication only through traceable platforms approved by the school district, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it also allows for parents to opt in for other means of communication per teacher or volunteer or coach that they're in communication with, and parents can approve those communications.
So who does this law apply to?
It applies to everybody who's in a position of authority within our school system, certified, non-certified staff, volunteers, extracurriculars, with coaching volunteers and coaching staff.
Which leads to the questions I have, particularly as it regards to volunteers or people connected to churches. Many churches have student pastors or other ministry leaders who serve as volunteers in public schools. They are club sponsors or coaches, whatever it may be. How does this bill affect their communication with students who may also be attending their churches?
That's a great question. And it's one that I've gotten many times since this bill became law. I think what we really see, a lot of churches already have policies in place to ensure student safety that are working with their youth pastors or mentorship through their pastors. Usually the parent is typically involved and they understand they're communicating. I hope that this gives an opportunity for churches that don't have anything in place, for ministries that don't have any policies in place, to go ahead and adopt policies to ensure student safety. Unfortunately, this is an issue not just within school systems, it's an issue within our churches. And we've seen that over the years and with stories that come out. And I hope that this moves into the ministry and church arena, and we start seeing our churches become more stringent and protective of their students and the communications that they may be having that might not be appropriate. And so hopefully this will cross over. Right now, if a volunteer is working within the school system and they're also a youth pastor, they can have their parents, the parents of the students, sign a waiver for them to be able to communicate with those students outside of the school system that are involved in their activities.
So again, it must involve the parents.
Yes.
How should a ministry leader respond, another example, to a social media message or some other communication initiated by the student that is in crisis? If a student is in crisis, reaches out in a non-approved platform, how should that ministry leader or student pastor respond?
Yeah, obviously, if that student pastor is volunteering in the school, this would apply to them. If they're not, it doesn't apply to them. But regardless, I would bring that parent into the situation. If it's an issue where the parent can't be brought into that situation, I'd bring the pastor into that situation and make sure that there's other eyes on that crisis. Obviously, our kids that are coming to our churches and involved in youth groups, they lean heavily on the mentorship role that a pastor will have over their lives. And that's a wonderful thing. As much as possible, bring the parent into that. And of course, they can, again, have those waivers signed by the parent to allow that direct communication.
You mentioned waivers before, so the parent can sign a waiver that will allow the student pastor, ministry leader to be in contact through various channels with that student.
Yeah, absolutely.
Are student ministers who volunteer in the school district, can they apply for the waiver themselves, or how does that work?
No, it's really up to the parents to be able to fill out that waiver. But what I would recommend, if the youth leader or ministry volunteer is involved at the school, that they go ahead and let their parents know, hey, this is the new law. Here's the process to go through, so that if you approve of communications, go ahead and fill that out. It'll be on file with the school and everything will be good.
That leads to the next question. How should student ministry leaders advise volunteers they work with, such as small group leaders, Sunday school teachers, etc., about communicating with students in their group if those volunteers also work for the school district?
The same thing. I would get the parent involved to give those permissions for them to have those communications. Again, the state really can't reach into the church and dictate how the church operates, but it would be my hope that churches in general would adopt policies, if they haven't already, to be able to ensure safe communications within their roles as mentorship to students.
Does this include bus drivers? If a ministry leader drives a bus, a school bus, does this law apply to them? And what
Yes.
guidance would you give them as well?
Yeah, same thing. I would just have parents who they're interacting with outside of the church, if they're a part of their school, to fill out those waivers for them to be able to have those communications. And again, this is about private, direct communication with students. And oftentimes that's not happening. But if a church youth minister has a certain platform that they use to communicate, go ahead and have parents opt in and allow them to have those communications. It's really just a safe way to ensure that volunteer is protected and the parents are involved in those communications.
If that volunteer student minister does not or is not employed by the school district, does this affect how they can communicate with public school students?
No, if they're not involved in in the public school system, that it doesn't pertain to them.
What about, and you mentioned churches before, does this law affect which social media groups or messaging platforms churches can use? Some have communications platforms they use for their entire congregation, and those students may be on that platform. Does this fall into that law?
No, not unless the pastor is volunteering at the school. It shouldn't affect how the churches communicate outside of any school relations.
You talked about churches incorporating these kinds of practices. Flesh that out for me. Can churches use the district's communication system if they choose to? How does that work?
Sure, they could if they choose to. Some of these platforms that our schools are adopting are specific to education, so it may not be one that a church has available to them. So they could utilize the same one if it's like Remind, for instance, is a great platform that's neutral and used for various different types of communications and groups, and it's traceable as well. So they could utilize that same platform, but within their own, the jurisdiction of the church, and not necessarily reaching into the school's use of their platform.
As you mentioned earlier, your hope is that this may cause some churches to look at their own communications policies and maybe adopt some of these practices.
Sure, absolutely. And I was thrilled to hear about a very large Christian school, private Christian school, that's already implementing a policy, which obviously we can't reach into the private schools as well, but they're already looking at adopting some things to ensure safety for their staff and their students. And I don't see why we shouldn't see churches do that as well. I know a lot of churches already have those policies in place. So this would be a great measure. I think it's just a natural means to be very intentional about technology and how that's really affecting our students these days. We have so many kids that are just on social, on platforms where they're accessible. And if we can make sure that we have parent involvement in those communications and a traceable form, I think we're going to see, it would be my hope that we'll see lower cases of inappropriate communications and cases that come onto the news. Honestly, it just frustrates me to continue to see cases within public education, private education, churches, where students are, and unfortunately, we have bad actors that pursue these locations where kids are easily accessible. If we can close that loophole of accessibility, I think we'll be able to protect students. We'll be able to protect the integrity of our institutions as well.
You mentioned private schools. Does this apply to private school communication or just public school?
This doesn't apply directly to private schools. I think that's a good point. They don't accept tax dollars from us, but oftentimes when we pass legislation, private schools are watching, and they'll begin to implement some of those laws that we're putting in place that are in regards to education. So I'm very hopeful that a lot of private schools will adopt these measures as well.
But if a private school teacher, counselor, coach, whatever, communicates with a student who's in a public school, it would apply, right?
No, it really couldn't apply because that teacher is not certified through that public school.
Lots of questions people are asking. I appreciate your taking time to answer these.
Yeah, absolutely.
So where do people turn when they have questions like this? Where do they turn to get answers?
Yeah, so I think we're going to see a lot of the questions get fleshed out as we move forward. I am working on a draft to bring some clarification to this bill, and some of the measures within the bill that have come forward are bringing up some conversations. And oftentimes we'll see that when we pass legislation, we need to go back in and tweak some things and clean it up a little bit. So I'm working on that right now. I'm hoping to present my draft to one of the interim education committees within the next, I don't know when we'll be able to do that, in the July meeting or the August meeting. And then what we'll see in January, this is a hot topic and there's a lot of questions. We'll go ahead and file change to this in the first couple of days of session. We've seen this move through just recently with a provision regarding fish and wildlife, and passed it the first day in both chambers, got it moved through, and the governor signed it, and we were able to make that correction very rapidly in the beginning of session. So any changes that we need to make, they'll happen relatively quickly once we get back into session. But I think as we move through this, a lot of the questions are going to answer themselves, hopefully. I think we're going to see, as the schools start to implement this, as people start getting used to the traceable communication applications that they're utilizing in their schools, and the waiver forms for parents to opt into those communications outside of those systems, we're going to see a lot of the questions answered. There's a lot of what ifs right now, and a lot of scenarios that are being thrown my way. I've gotten tons of emails and lots of interview requests to try and answer some of those questions, and we're answering them as we can. And the ones we can't answer, we're starting to look back at the language of the bill to see, how can we tweak this? How do we make this work without lessening the intent of the bill, and hoping that we'll be able to move forward with a strong piece of legislation and policy that still protects our kids and our institutions.
Can you say yet what kinds of tweaks you're looking at?
Yeah, so there was some question into if schools had to accept those waivers. I want to clarify that they're required to accept those waivers. We're going to clarify some of the definitions of a volunteer and what that looks like, more specific to volunteers that are in the schools on a more regular basis, not necessarily the parent that volunteers on a field trip. So we're going to tweak that a little bit. We're also going to look at the family definition. There were some questions that came up about step parents, and which I had assumed in the definition it already answered that, but there's some question about that. So we're going to make that clear and make sure our in-laws, sister-in-law, my daughter-in-law works at my daughter's school. And so again, when I wrote sister and brother, I assumed that meant sister-in-law and brother-in-law, but we're just going to bring some clarification to some of those definitions of families who are already automatically exempt.
I'm glad you mentioned, defining a volunteer,
Mm-hmm.
because we've gotten questions. For example, if a ministry leader has helped with a project or event in the past, does that make them a volunteer? Does this law apply to them?
Right. That's a good question. And I think we'll bring some clarity to that when we get this draft fully flushed out.
Right now, I guess they should consider themselves, yes, volunteers and go through the process.
I think it wouldn't hurt if I think that's a good question, but I feel like the language probably speaks more clearly to current volunteers as opposed to past volunteers. If they're not actively involved in the school right now as a volunteer, I don't think that it would pertain to them. But again, another reason to bring some clarification to the language.
Last question. Even those who support, and I think most people would support this kind of measure to protect kids, even those who may support it have questions about its constitutionality. How do you respond to those constitutional questions? Free speech questions, religious expression questions?
I don't think that it has a constitutional issue. When you look at regulating First Amendment rights within the public school sector with K-12, and we really addressed a lot of this with the DEI bill in post-secondary. Post-secondary, you really do have to be careful, but within K-12, it operates a little bit differently. We do have, as a state, we have an interest in the safety of children. So we are able to put in measures that are more strict within that K-12 system in order to ensure safety. And where that looks like it might step on a person's constitutional rights to, I guess, a First Amendment right in order to access students, it really doesn't. Like it really, this bill is upholding the parental right that we've seen the Supreme Court clarify and uphold for years, that the parents have the interest of their students falls on them in protecting them. And this measure is really a parental rights bill to be able to make sure they have knowledge of who's communicating with their children and give that permission in who can have access to private conversations with their kids.
Senator Tichenor, thank you so much. We appreciate your time and for some
Thank you.
clarification on these questions.
Absolutely. Thanks for reaching out and having me on.
Look for more on this issue in the coming days on KentuckyToday.com. And while you're there, sign up for the Morning Briefing, our daily news digest email. And for more on the Kentucky Baptist Convention and the Cooperative Program, which makes this podcast possible, go to kybaptist.org. Lord willing, we'll see you next time on the Kentucky Today podcast.